smuggling, espionage, a state monopoly so strictly enforced that violating it could mean execution. A plant for which one man endured weeks of unbearable thirst rather than let it wither and die. It sounds like the plot of a spy thriller, but these are actually the ingredients behind your morning cup of coffee. Coffee is the second most traded commodity in the world after oil. Every day, humanity drinks more than 2 billion cups of it. Yet almost no one holding that cup realizes that the plant inside it was once at the center of one of the bloodiest and most fiercely protected monopolies in the history of global trade. A monopoly that was ultimately broken by a single man carrying a stolen coffee seedling aboard a ship. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because this story does not begin with the cup in your hands. It begins with a goat. Sometime around the 9th century, in the mountain forests of Ethiopia, a young goat herd named Kaldi noticed something unusual about his herd. Goats that ate the bright red berries from a particular shrub growing on a hillside near the town of Kaffa suddenly stopped sleeping at night. They leaped into the air, butted one another, and behaved as if they had been filled with energy from nowhere. Kaldi watched this strange behavior for several days before finally deciding to taste the berries himself. Within minutes, he felt a surge of alertness unlike anything he had ever experienced before. His exhaustion vanished. His mind became remarkably clear. He had, in a sense, just consumed the world's first cup of coffee, if, of course, the story was ever true. The problem is that no one can say for certain whether Kaldi actually existed. The earliest written version of this legend does not appear until the 15th century, some 600 years after the events it supposedly describes. But what makes the story fascinating is that its geography matches reality almost perfectly. Wild Arabica coffee still grows in the mountain forests of Ethiopia, at the same elevations and in the same shaded environment described in the legend. And the region surrounding Kaffa is indeed considered the birthplace of coffee itself. The plant had been growing there for thousands of years before anyone discovered what it could become. Long before anyone thought of roasting the beans, local people chewed the leaves and mixed the coffee cherries into a paste with animal fat as a source of energy. But the true turning point in this story did not happen in Ethiopia. It happened on the other side of the Red Sea, where a very different and much darker chapter begins. According to the legend, Kaldi brought his discovery to a nearby monastery. One of the monks declared the berries to be the work of the devil and threw them into the fire. And this is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. As the berries roasted in the flames, they released such a rich and intoxicating aroma that the other monks came running from every corner of the monastery. They raked the roasted beans out of the embers, crushed them into a coarse powder, mixed them with hot water, and drank the result. That night, they stayed awake through the entire evening service without closing their eyes for a single moment. Word spread rapidly through the monasteries of Ethiopia. But coffee did not become the force that transformed everyday life across entire societies until it reached Yemen, and it is here that the truly dangerous part of this story begins. By the 15th century, Sufi monks in the port cities of Yemen had turned the drinking of coffee into a spiritual practice. They called the beverage kawa, an ancient Arabic word that had originally referred to wine, and used it deliberately to remain awake during long nights of prayer and meditation. The Sufis did not drink coffee for pleasure or conversation. They drank it because they believed it sharpened the mind and brought them closer to the divine. It was their secret tool of spiritual devotion, and they guarded that knowledge carefully. Yemen became the first country to cultivate coffee as a true agricultural crop, growing it on terraced plantations in the mountains surrounding Sana'a. The port city of Mocha, on the coast of the Red Sea, became the center of the entire global coffee trade.
and the name of that port became so deeply embedded in languages around the world that you still hear it every time you order a mocha in a coffee shop anywhere, from Paris to New York. Every single coffee bean leaving the Arabian Peninsula passed through this one port. And this is where the Yemenis did something genuinely ingenious. Before export, every bean was either boiled or partially roasted, specifically to destroy its ability to germinate. No merchant could carry away a viable seed and plant coffee anywhere else in the world. At the time, the decision may have seemed like a minor precaution. In reality, it would turn the next 2 centuries into a prolonged struggle between Yemen's coffee monopoly and the rest of the world, which was becoming increasingly desperate for the drink. While Yemen maintained its grip on the global coffee trade, coffee itself had already spread beyond the Arabian Peninsula, and the Ottoman Empire embraced it with an enthusiasm bordering on obsession. By the beginning of the 16th century, coffee houses had spread throughout Istanbul, Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, and Mecca. These were not quiet, cozy establishments. They were crowded social hubs where men gathered to discuss politics, read poetry, play backgammon and chess, listen to storytellers, and openly gossip about the Sultan and his court. According to some estimates, by the middle of the 16th century, Istanbul alone was home to more than 600 coffee houses. And this is where the real conflict begins. Because when ordinary people gather in large numbers and start openly discussing politics, rulers become uneasy. In 1511, the governor of Mecca, Hayr Beg, attempted to ban coffee entirely, declaring it an intoxicating substance forbidden under Islamic law. He ordered coffee houses closed and had their patrons arrested. The ban lasted for less than a year before the Sultan in Cairo overturned it and the governor himself was removed from office.
But the real nightmare began a century later. Ottoman Sultan Murad IV, who ruled during the 1630s, believed in no half measures. He outlawed coffee completely, ordered every coffee house in Istanbul to be closed, and, according to contemporary accounts, decreed that a first offense would be punished with flogging, while a second offense would be punished by drowning in the Bosphorus. Some chronicles from the period even claim that the Sultan personally wandered the streets of the capital at night in disguise, searching for violators and executing them on the spot. Historians continue to debate the accuracy of some of these details, but the broader conclusion is unmistakable. Coffee had become so deeply woven into the social life of the Ottoman Empire that the ruler of one of the world's greatest powers regarded it as a direct threat to his own authority. By all logic, such fierce opposition should have brought the spread of coffee to an end. Instead, it had already crossed the borders of the empire and reached a place where it would be embraced with no less fanaticism, but for exactly the opposite reason. The first European coffee houses opened in Venice around 1629, established by Italian merchants. The reaction of the Catholic Church was immediate and hostile. Clergymen in Rome denounced coffee as the bitter invention of Satan, a dark, exotic drink from the Muslim world created to corrupt Christian souls. Members of the clergy petitioned the Pope to ban it completely, and an official hearing on the matter was convened at the Vatican. And here, the story takes a completely unexpected turn. Pope Clement VIII decided to do what any reasonable person might have done: taste the controversial drink for himself. According to the legend, after trying it, he remarked something to the effect of, "This drink of Satan is so delicious that it would be a shame to leave it entirely to the infidels. We should trick the devil by baptizing it instead." And just like that, with a single remark, coffee received the Pope's blessing, a moment that, in retrospect, can be seen as either one of the most ingenious political moves in the history of the Vatican, or as one of history's most amusing coincidences, depending on whom you ask. Within just a few decades, coffee houses had spread across Europe,
and they began to transform the way entire societies functioned. By the beginning of the 18th century, London alone was home to more than 3,000 coffee houses. They became known as penny universities because for the price of a single penny paid for a cup of coffee, anyone could spend hours listening to some of England's sharpest minds debate philosophy, natural science, and colonial politics. Lloyd's of London began in the coffee house of Edward Lloyd. Jonathan's Coffee House became the birthplace of what would later develop into the London Stock Exchange. In France, Café Procope welcomed Voltaire, who, according to some accounts, drank 40 to 50 cups of coffee a day, which goes a long way toward explaining his extraordinary productivity. But the Europeans faced one enormous problem. Every bean of coffee they consumed came exclusively from Yemen, and the Yemenis had no intention of sharing their monopoly. Every attempt to smuggle viable coffee seeds out of Yemen ran into a wall. Trade routes were tightly controlled, the beans were treated before export, and the Yemeni authorities had every reason to protect their monopoly for as long as possible. The clock, however, was already ticking. The Yemenis simply could not hear it yet, because in 1616, the Dutch merchant Peter van den Broek managed to steal a living coffee plant directly from the port of Mocha and smuggle it aboard a merchant ship to Amsterdam. The Dutch East India Company successfully cultivated it in the botanical gardens of the Netherlands and then did exactly what every colonial power of the era did. It transferred its prize to its overseas possessions. Coffee plantations were established on Ceylon and on the island of Java with such remarkable success that the word Java is still used as a colloquial name for coffee more than 4 centuries later.
But the most extraordinary story of coffee smuggling did not belong to the Dutch. It belonged to the French, and it deserves a film of its own. In 1723, the French naval officer Gabriel de Clew set sail from France for the Caribbean island of Martinique with a single coffee seedling on board, a cutting that had originally been presented by the Dutch to King Louis XIV and was kept in a glass case on the deck of the ship. From the very beginning, everything went wrong. The vessel was attacked by Tunisian pirates in the Mediterranean Sea. Out in the Atlantic Ocean, it was nearly overturned by a violent storm. One of the passengers, either jealous of de Clew's mission or simply driven mad by the long voyage, attempted to tear the plant from its container and destroy it. De Clew fought him off, but one of the branches was torn away. Then, the ship began to run dangerously low on fresh water, and the captain imposed strict rationing. And it was here that de Clew made the decision that would shape the future of the coffee industry across an entire continent. He began sharing his own drinking water with the plant, enduring weeks of thirst himself rather than let the fragile seedling die. He finally reached Martinique, sunburned, dehydrated, and utterly exhausted, but with the little coffee tree still clinging to life. He nurtured it in the island's volcanic soil, and within a few years, that single plant had produced enough seedlings to establish coffee plantations throughout the French Caribbean. Today, nearly every coffee tree in Central America and a significant portion of those in South America can trace its genetic lineage back to that one cutting, the one for which a single man nearly died of thirst in the middle of the ocean. Remember this detail because it explains virtually everything that is about to happen to the coffee industry across an entire continent. In 1727, the Portuguese colonial authorities in Brazil realized something deeply frustrating. They possessed millions of hectares of land with an ideal climate for coffee, tropical heat, fertile soil, and an abundant supply of inexpensive labor, but they had no access to the plant itself. The French and the Dutch guarded their coffee colonies jealously and had no intention of sharing them with anyone.
So Brazil sent a man named Francisco de Melo Palheta to the colony of French Guiana, supposedly on a diplomatic mission to help settle a border dispute between the French and the Dutch. Palheta was charming, eloquent, and, judging by historical accounts, exceptionally skilled at what he was really doing: espionage. While negotiations were taking place in the city of Cayenne, he is said to have begun a romantic affair with the wife of the French colonial governor. When the time came for him to depart, she presented him with a farewell bouquet of flowers during a public banquet. Hidden inside the bouquet were viable coffee seeds and cuttings. Palheta smuggled them across the border into Brazil and planted them in the northern province of Pará. Within a few decades, coffee cultivation spread south through Maranhão, Bahia, Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais. Brazil became the largest coffee producer on Earth, a title it still holds today, supplying roughly 1/3 of the world's coffee harvest. Think about that for a moment. Brazil's modern coffee industry, worth tens of billions of dollars, exists because of a flirtation at a diplomatic banquet nearly 3 centuries ago. But behind that astonishing rise was a cost that is far less often told with the same sense of adventure. The plantations that spread across the Caribbean, Central and South America, and Southeast Asia were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, built on the labor of enslaved peoples. The Dutch relied on enslaved Africans taken from West Africa to work plantations in Suriname, while also forcing the people of Java into labor under the threat of violence. The French depended on enslaved labor in Haiti, Martinique, and Guadeloupe, where conditions became so brutal that the coffee and sugar plantations helped fuel the Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791. Brazil, which eventually surpassed every other coffee-producing nation combined, relied on enslaved labor on virtually all of its coffee plantations until slavery was abolished in 1888. It remained the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, and coffee was one of the principal economic forces that kept the institution alive for so long. Plantation owners often found it cheaper to work people literally to death and replace them with newly purchased enslaved workers than to invest in better living and working conditions. The wealth generated by coffee flowed upward to landowners in Brazil and merchants in London, Amsterdam, and New York, while the human cost was borne almost entirely by Africans and indigenous peoples who never saw even a fraction of those profits. In December 1773, American colonists threw hundreds of chests of British tea into Boston Harbor in protest against taxation without representation. That political act also had a very practical side effect. Almost overnight, drinking tea in the colonies became unpatriotic. Merchants selling British tea were boycotted, and tea drinkers were mocked as supporters of the crown. Americans needed a replacement, and coffee filled that role almost immediately. Within just a few years, coffee had completely displaced tea as the preferred beverage in the 13 colonies. The coffee houses of Philadelphia, New York, and Boston became gathering places where leaders of the independence movement planned their next steps, and that shift proved to be permanent. Today, the United States remains the world's largest coffee consumer in absolute terms, and the roots of that habit can be traced directly back to a single political protest in Boston Harbor nearly 2.5 centuries ago.
The 19th century transformed coffee from a luxury into an everyday drink for working people. Then came the wars, and coffee shifted from being a household beverage to becoming a strategic military resource. During the American Civil War, Union soldiers received coffee beans as part of their daily rations and treated them as a prized possession. The Confederacy, cut off from imports by the Union blockade, faced severe shortages and attempted to replace coffee with chicory and acorns, but nothing could match the real drink. Some historians argue that the North's reliable access to coffee provided a genuine strategic advantage during the war. The world wars of the 20th century cemented coffee's place in modern culture even further. The United States military purchased such enormous quantities that shortages appeared within the country itself, and during the World War II, millions of packets of instant coffee were distributed to soldiers across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. By that point, coffee's reputation seemed unshakable, but the industry was about to face a crisis that no one had seen coming.
The 1960s and 70s brought something the major coffee companies never expected. The quality of the product declined dramatically. In the pursuit of lower costs, coffee roasters began blending low-grade Robusta with Arabica, cutting corners during roasting and prioritizing shelf life over flavor. By the 1970s, the coffee found on American supermarket shelves was often weak, stale, and over-extracted. For the first time in the nation's history, coffee consumption per person in the United States began to decline. If the story had ended there, it would have been a very different and far less interesting one. But in 1971, three friends opened a small shop called Starbucks in Seattle's Pike Place Market. At first, they did not sell prepared coffee at all. They offered only high-quality whole beans sourced from small farms, along with brewing equipment. A decade later, a young marketing director named Howard Schultz joined the company. During a business trip to Milan, he walked into an Italian espresso bar and saw far more than a cup of coffee. He saw theater, ritual, and a community of regulars greeting one another by name across the counter. He became convinced that this was exactly what American coffee was missing. Not simply better beans, but the entire experience. Today, the global coffee industry generates more than $400 billion in annual revenue, and the livelihoods of more than 125 million people around the world depend directly on coffee cultivation. And perhaps the most fitting part of the story is that the plant eventually returned to where it all began. Ethiopia, the homeland of the legendary shepherd, remains one of the most respected coffee-producing countries in the specialty coffee industry, while beans from the regions of Yirgacheffe, Sidamo, and Guji are prized for flavor profiles found nowhere else on Earth. The journey from wild berries growing on the slopes of an Ethiopian mountain to the cup in your hands took 6 centuries. It passed through smuggling, espionage, slavery, revolution, corporate decline, and an extraordinary revival. And tomorrow morning, you will most likely pour yourself another cup without thinking about a single one of those stories. But now, at least, you know what truly lies behind every sip.